The Steady State Sentinels, produced by the Steady State, a community of former national security professionals who spent their careers safeguarding the United States, at home and abroad.
Today, we continue that mission by staying true to our oaths to defend the Constitution,
uphold our democracy,
and protect our nation's security. Join our expert hosts as they interview field-tested guests whose unique experiences shed light on the crises and challenges facing our nation.
Hello, I'm Peter Mina, a civil rights and federal employment law attorney, as well as a former Department of Homeland Security official who worked to integrate civil rights and civil liberties protections in the department's national security programs. And you are listening to the Steady State Sentinel from the Steady State. We are facing an existential threat, growing autocracy in the United States. The Steady State Sentinel is a place where we and our distinguished guests use our national security expertise to discuss and analyze the decisions and acts of this administration that feed that autocratic slide and threaten to supplant the pillars of our constitutional democracy. Today, we're talking with Jim O'Brien, the chair of the board of the Steady State and a former State Department official, about our organization, its role in protecting democracy, the rule of law, and national security. We'll also talk to Jim about the president's transactional foreign policy and what it means for both for folks here at home as well as our traditional partners abroad. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
All right. So I think, where I'd like to start is basically your origin story. So tell me a little bit about why you got into public service in the first place.
I just think the career government service is one of the great innovations of the last couple hundred years. The idea that there are people who are expected to become expert in some areas and to offer their views over long careers is, I think, a key part of what keeps us free and keeps us safe. It's a real step away from personalized bureaucracies, court politics that typified a lot of certainly European politics, into the middle of the 19th century. So that, I think, explains both where I came from and why I'm with the Steady State. I grew up in Nebraska for the most part, a little bit elsewhere in the Midwest. And I always loved reading the stories of people who were working to make life better, whether in whatever sector, but especially some of the folks in the government, whether working in foreign policy, which is the field I ended up in, justice, which was the field I was trained for, or other agencies making food safer. I'm from an agricultural state. So all of that stuff just struck me as a really honorable and exciting way to lead a life. As I made my way through school, trying to decide if I wanted to teach or if I wanted to work, once I decided that I was going to work maybe as a lawyer, I was really only interested in doing it as a career government official.
Well, and as a lawyer as well, that obviously that story is near and dear to my heart too. But what especially drew you to, and you made obviously reference to your illustrious career in foreign policy, but what drew you to national security and diplomacy in particular?
Yeah, some of it was just, the normal accidents. I had a couple of professors who had worked in the field and felt that it presented a lot of really interesting questions. And one of them said to me, I think you'd like the fact that this is a field that is collaborative. I mean, you're often arguing against people, but you're always working with a lot of people. So it's not just at the State Department, where famously you have both people with substantive expertise and regional expertise who have to be involved in every decision. But then I'd be working with people from across the intelligence community. My second day on the job at the State Department, I had to go visit the CIA and work on some arrangements that they were looking to put overseas. And my second day was 9 days before the fall of the Berlin Wall. That tells you how long ago this was. And so I just came to love getting to know people from around the government who were working on real problems that matter to Americans, and that I think is the real tradition of the career service.
And so we've been talking a lot about the career service, and I was a career servant as well, as are many of our
Yeah.
members. But you also had the opportunity to serve as a political appointee. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the dynamic between careers and political appointees and what it was like to make that transition.
Yeah, and it sort of happened organically at first, and then as a result of an election with a long gap. So I was a career civil servant. I started, as I said, 10 days before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was going to stay a year in government, then go off probably to be a law professor somewhere. Um, and what I instead, I stayed because the work was interesting and I thought important. I became the State Department lawyer on the laws of armed conflict, a subject that's been on the front page of the news
Absolutely.
in the last few days, working with some enormously talented lawyers from across the government. And Yugoslavia imploded. So this was in the early 90s.
Right.
And so their atrocities were a part of the warfare. And we began to think that this was something we should maybe call crimes when they were crimes. We should gather the information the US government had. And then ultimately that we thought that some accountability for the criminals was going to be critical for there to be peace. Because the people who commit the crimes are the people who don't want there to be peace, certainly not a negotiated ceasefire. And that really was borne out. I became the lead government lawyer on many elements of the Yugoslav peace deals in the mid 90s. Through all that work, I started to work a lot with then UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright, and eventually went to work on her staff. So when she became secretary, I was her policy advisor for her time as secretary. And by the end of that period, I realized that in essence, I'd become much more a policy and political person than a career lawyer. And I just felt it would be uncomfortable for me to work in an administration where I knew I would disagree with many of the political stances, even if they were not ones that directly affected my portfolio. So it was time to leave. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, that's a really interesting thought because I think about, my own career where, I was the senior career official and my immediate supervisor was a political appointee, from either administration.
Yeah.
And, when I think about the senior executive service, whether that is the traditional, civilian staff or, obviously at the State Department, senior foreign service officers. And I wonder if more folks at that level don't have that similar feeling. Because I can imagine, particularly if you are a senior advisor, a chief of staff, someone who was so close to the political, how do you make that transition? Though that is our charge to that next administration that may have a completely different viewpoint on your work.
Yeah. I actually thought, we all play different roles in our lives. And I always felt at the State Department under the first Bush administration, where I was a very junior lawyer, and then the Clinton administration, the role of the career service, civil servants like I was, or foreign service officers, the role was to try to explain the world to the political appointees. What the rules were, what the possibilities were, what are things that can be done, and that conversation between career people and political people, I think, is the key thing that needs to be preserved.
Yes.
The career people see these issues over time. They know how foreign governments are manipulating, lying to political appointees, right? And now I've seen it from both sides. You show up as a political appointee from several years out in the wilderness. You've got all these ideas. You got some contacts. You're impatient. Maybe you had to wait a year and a half to get confirmed, as I did under the Biden administration. So you show up and you're just anxious to get stuff done. And the career people say, well, when this person told you yes, he really meant no. Or He's going to do yes as long as you're looking at him. But the instant you get a new job, and I changed, I was head of sanctions at the start of the Biden administration, and then became responsible for Europe. They said as soon as you move, this person is going to stop doing everything that was promised to you. And hearing that from people, I got to say, as a political appointee, it's really annoying because
Sure, I can imagine.
you sort of hate it. But at the same time, it's critical. You have to know that this is what is happening because it then changes what's presented to the other side. It changes what you're expecting, the benchmarks, how often you check back in, what you leave to your successors. And my hope is that by being an effective political appointee, you can leave to the people who come after you some new initiative or effort or tool that they can then use productively. So just here's one example. At the end of the Clinton administration, I found myself meeting often with the then head of the Office of Foreign Asset Control at Treasury, OFAC. OFAC was just a couple dozen people. There wasn't really, it was a very kind of simple operation at the time. And we hit on the idea that it would be better for the US to give up some of our cumbersome trade embargo type sanctions. I was very focused on the Balkans. Those tended to create a lot of smuggling, right? And they allowed the individuals who controlled the smuggling to become the oligarchs of the region. We thought maybe with a lot of those should be given up, and we developed a path to give them up as the policy warranted. But we should focus on finance and try to find a way to get at the money that corrupt political actors were using to control their political bases out of the key capitals that were fomenting the war. And so we began to develop that idea there. That's what I left when I walked out the door in January 2001. My successors then had experience of working on financial sanctions that wasn't really a key feature of sanctions regimes up to that point. After 9/11, the focus on the way that terrorists made and moved their money moved front and center in the response to 9/11. That's the kind of exchange, even between, a politically opposed administrations, but it's the sort of thing that the career people carried forward. The OFAC folks who remained when I left state were actually able to be right in the middle of a really important answer to the attacks of 9/11. And there are other examples. I was involved in establishing the Yugoslav Criminal Tribunal. Without that, I think there would have been no peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina because it was the criminals who wanted the war to continue. But it wasn't in keeping with much of the incoming Bush administration's kind of core views of sovereignty.
Huh?
They quickly saw, though, that it was an important tool to remove people who otherwise would give haven to terrorists or would disrupt other countries and make them safe havens for terrorists. So they actually took the tool that hadn't existed since the end of World War II and began to use it in a way that met a very different policy environment. That kind of thing can only be done by career officials. If everyone walks out the door at the end of every administration, you don't have that kind of institutional knowledge. And I really fear that what's going on today with the attacks on the career service means we're going to know much less when it comes time to face a new situation later in this administration.
Well, so you've given me a perfect segue. So I think, you talked a lot about leaving something for your successor to build upon. You talked about the transition to, following the money. And so I guess, I'd love for you to react to, what is currently happening at the State Department at a sort of the dismantling of our relationships abroad. And what does that mean in the long term? How do you get back to an environment where you can have that transition, especially when, as this administration comes in, rather than looking to the careers and saying like, hey, what's working, what's not, it's well, you must be enemies of whatever the administration is doing. I don't want to listen to you because you're just going to try and stop me from doing what I want to do.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of different approaches. I mean, to me, the start was the first thing I did. The first thing every civil servant does is take an oath to defend the Constitution, and that was always enough. That's the commitment. This administration has added a requirement at the State Department of fidelity to the secretary. I can't imagine having a requirement to follow any political official of any party. It should be that you're there to take care of the Constitution. You do that by respecting the decisions of the people who are duly authorized to make decisions. But you don't express fidelity or worship for a political official. That's what they're doing. On top of it, this administration has a core of people who believe that the career service is the enemy of their political movement.
Right.
Why is that? The ones I've gotten to know, and I spent much of the last year, in Europe and talking to people there, but the people who come and speak on behalf of the administration often say that institutions like the career service or independent research organizations, whether universities, civil society, law firms, that these are sort of incubators for secular ideas or progressive ideas, and therefore they have to be attacked. And that viewpoint, I think, will take us to the Dark Ages. So the way that they are doing this is by shutting down voices of expertise and shutting out the people who remain. So at the State Department, you see a couple things happening. I mean, Secretary Rubio showed up and started criticizing the workforce as woke, as intent on carrying out initiatives that undermine the security of the American people. All this barking like a small dog at his own workforce struck me as very strange. And instead, and now many of the career people who maybe know the most about Russia and Ukraine are not included in discussions with those places. So you have a situation where Russia and Ukraine are talking to each other against the backdrop of 30 years since Ukraine's independence and decades before of a constant back and forth between Moscow and Kyiv, and between Moscow and the regions and Kyiv and the regions. So they're having a long-running dialogue, and this administration is dropping in people with absolutely no background or understanding of what's being said or how it resonates with the people who are actually fighting. That's a terrible thing, and that's a choice the secretary made. I'm going to add one more element to this, which is they're only playing with half a deck because they came in committed, the White House committed them to an idea that white men should be in charge. And you have this explicitly from one senior political appointee, but the idea that white men were somehow discriminated against. Look, when I walked out the door, I was in charge of 11,000 people in Europe, and there was a review of the entire State Department. There were about 75,000 people who were working in the State Department at the time. 2,300 of them are the senior Foreign Service officers.
Right.
The ones who become ambassadors, office directors, all the key people. So maybe, I don't know, a third of those people are gone. But at the time I walked out the door, probably 60%, 2/3 of those people were white men. That's the legacy of old State Department hiring.
Right.
So the most senior ones have been driven out. The problem is the next cadre, the group that has been in for 20 years or so, hired by Colin Powell, by Condi Rice, a little bit by Madeleine Albright. That group is incredibly talented, and it's ready to lead, to take over from baby boomers like me. Problem is that group's really diverse. It's half, maybe a little more than half women. It's about a third not white. It represents America in every good way possible. But when I look at the State Department website now, I see of the top 40 to 45 positions, like 37 of them are white guys. I mean, maybe a couple identifies Latin, I don't know.
Sure.
But they're not allowing the most talented part of their workforce to step up into leadership positions. And that is bad for America because these are the people who are ready to lead. And then they're promoting a bunch of the added answer I get when I ask friends of mine who's doing this or that job often is like a weird shrug. They say, we don't know. They're dragging these guys out of obscure positions and putting them in charge. So we're not going to have, when this administration ends, as I believe it will, we're not going to have the very best people spending this time learning how to work with an avowedly America First point of view so that they can bring knowledge from that into the next administration. We're going to likely have this sharp cut in expertise because of the people who benefited from the war on woke are going to realize they're not going to be around, so they'll take off. And then you'll have to somehow recreate the cadre that we need going forward.
So much to react to there. I mean, I think the first thing that resonates with me as you were talking is, as a senior career official, sure, I had my own political views, but at the end of the day, my responsibility was to execute the mission of the Department of Homeland Security as best I could.
Right.
And
Right.
to your point about, duly authorized officials, if my boss decided we were going to do something that I didn't personally disagree with, that's not my job to say, no,
Yeah.
you've got to do it a different way. My job is to give the best advice that I can. And then ultimately, so long as that decision made by the duly authorized official is lawful,
Yeah.
that's your call.
Yeah.
And that's what a career employee is supposed to do. But we seem to have lost that. There's no desire to hear contrary views. There's no pressure testing anymore. So we live in this echo chamber. And then I think the other thing that that struck me about what you were saying is, I feel like now as someone of color who was an executive in the government, now it's just sort of like, oh, well, you must have been a DEI hire.
Yeah.
And people don't even understand what DEI means, let alone how to use it. And I think about what the president was quoted as saying within the last week or so, basically that the civil rights make it hard for white people.
Yeah.
And and that's pretty much all you need to know about this administration. And unfortunately, to your point, it cuts against, in my opinion, everything America stands for. And to your point, it is particularly in the diplomatic corps, you have to have a workforce, I would imagine, that reflects not only the country, but also the areas where they're going to be serving.
And just a different set of experiences.
Mhm.
The old joke about the State Department was it was male, pale, and Yale. And, there probably was a little truth of that. When I
Sure.
started in the late 80s, I could look around at the people who were the most senior. But, by the time, certainly when I came back into the Biden administration and saw the people who had begun migrating up, there were a couple of changes, some of which might be seen as DEI, some of which were not. One of the most important changes, and it started a bit under Madeleine Albright, but it really took off under Colin Powell, was the decision to hire people who'd had life experience outside the Foreign Service. So rather than just taking, babies out of college or grad school and expecting them to stay for 30 years, you began to take people with 5, 10, 15 years experience in the military or in another agency or in the private sector. And that meant suddenly you were taking in from a range of people who weren't considered for membership 15, 20 years before. And that the way the room looks is different and the way it talks is different because you've got people who sat on trading desks. You've got people who were in the field as Peace Corps volunteers, which was always a kind of a career path. But all of these things contribute to a rich discussion that simply gets lost in the way that this tiny group of often avowedly Christian nationalists just want to push their agenda. That'll work for a time, but it's quickly going to run out of steam And I think this is the danger for Americans because a lot of, Trump is above everything else. He wants to be active every day. He wants to be the
Right.
center of attention and he wants to be doing things. But a lot of his foreign agenda really builds off issues that were inherited from the Biden administration. We had basically outlined a peace deal in the South Caucasus. As a lame duck administration, we couldn't get that done.
Right.
Trump, to his credit, brought the two presidents to the White, or President and Prime Minister to the White House, got the outlines of a deal. But now he's moved on,
Sure.
and there's a team working on it, but he's gone. So I don't know that there'll be the what's needed to really follow through. And you look across the range of topics he's involved in. The Gaza stuff was all stuff that people were working on before he came in. Russia, Ukraine, the outlines were, kind of there. He's kind of come to the end of that period. And he's got this tiny group that is really committed to its issues and won't listen to anyone else. And what have we gotten out of that in the last couple of weeks? Venezuela and now Greenland. And I don't think either of those things is going to do much to make it easier for people to find jobs or to build manufacturing capacity in the United States. And yet Trump will continue to be super energetic just based on what this ever smaller group talks to him about over the next few years. And I think that's a really dangerous environment for the U.S.
So I think we have, lots of fertile ground to talk about based on what you just said regarding Venezuela and Greenland. But before we get there, I would love to hear more about the steady state. And maybe, again, sort of as I asked you about your beginnings in public service, tell me a little bit about, how you came to join the organization and then ultimately what led you to become chair of the board of the steady state.
Well, so I had known the founders and the kind of initial people, many of whom came out of the intelligence community, and we had worked together in different capacities. So I was President Clinton's final envoy for the Balkans, and that put me in touch with a number of people from the Defense Department and the intelligence community. Then I was President Obama's envoy for hostage recovery, which was it was a really great organization that I didn't create. I was just put into it. But that brought together DHS, the intelligence community, the FBI, DOD, and others. We managed to get 100 people home in just over a year and a half, about a year and a half. And so from all those relationships, when I heard of the Steady State's establishment, I was really interested and participated in it a bit in the Trump administration. When I came out this time, I was more convinced than ever that it was vitally important to have an example of how trained professionals assess threats and develop responses to them. I saw that the Trump administration was trying to hollow out the institutions that provide decent assessment of what's dangerous and what are the best approaches to address them. So I was in touch again with Steve Cash, the executive director and really the driving force of the organization, and with a few other people who've been deeply involved in it. And as we started to talk about the organization, it was clear that they felt it would benefit by having somebody who didn't come from, say, the harder edges of national security, right?
Right. Sure.
Wasn't I wasn't certainly not undercover, but could try to talk about how the work that analysts do plays well into broader political trends. So I'm really enthused. I think one of the things the Steady State has begun doing is publish an assessment of American democracy.
Right.
And this is prepared by people who, for their entire careers, provided assessments of foreign democracies and have identified kind of key linchpins and the benchmarks to be used in assessing whether a democracy is healthy or whether it's under attack. The first installment of that was out a couple months ago. Another one is due out in about a week. So we'll just keep updating that. And part of what I like about it is it shows people some of the places they can make a difference. standing up for the independence of journalism. That's just maybe paying subscriptions and using certain, websites, assisting with access of journalists to cover the news. That's what we're seeing under attack in Minnesota right now, with the way ICE is trying to silence observers and harass and intimidate them. And so identifying those things, I think, is a great resource. It can be done best by people who have served at DHS like you did, or elsewhere in the intelligence community. And then we try to make that available to the public, but also to reporters and other organizations that are involved in the fight for democracy.
So just as a flag for folks that are interested in reading that initial assessment, and certainly the upcoming update, please visit our website at www.thesteadystate.org, where you can find all kinds of great information about our organization. And then again, these assessments and other tools to get informed and stay informed. So to that end, Jim, imagine you're talking to one of your neighbors in Nebraska. How would you explain why the steady state matters, and why should I care if I'm outside the Beltway? I mean, you and I, both were in the government for a long time. There are others in this community that might be interested, but if I have no connection and DC is a million miles away, why do I care?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. So folks in Nebraska are pretty sophisticated.
Mm-hmm.
My sister house sat for Warren Buffett, the guy, when I was growing up, the guy a few doors down negotiated the first big grain sale to the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I talk to people, when I'm back home visiting family, and okay, Omaha's kind of a blue dot, but
sure, right.
the number of people who say, yeah, I supported Trump, I liked this or that, but then they start to say, we sold our soybeans to China, and now China canceled the contracts. Be good to know what China it wants from the U.S. and what it expects to get from President Trump. And I say, well, there are people who are responsible for providing those views, but Trump doesn't want to listen to them. Or much of the Midwest now, the area I'm from, it's food industry, and those are overwhelmingly industries that employ recent migrants, many of them illegal. So there's a real problem. These are small towns that survive only because of irregular migration. And ICE has to decide, is it going to kill these small towns, or is it going to find some way to allow the industries to go forward? And so Omaha, for a while, I think well into the first Trump administration, had the highest per capita percentage of refugees. So not migrants, but of people under the refugee admissions program. And it's very proud of that. So you see a society that not only has maybe 20-25% Latin population that wasn't there when I was growing up, but that is now increasingly, you've got Somali, Ethiopian, a host of more recent refugee populations have moved in as well. And so it's a place that's deeply attuned to the world for the grain markets, which has always been the basis of politics in the Midwest. There's a reason the populist convention was held, or the main first candidate was Nebraskan. But it's also now tied by ties of family, by the ties of the military base that was there. And those people, I think, understand, or they say, they understand the importance of having expertise and a longer term perspective on what keeps Americans safe and what allows us to prosper. That's, I think, the bit of it is just a simple respect for people who know things. And that's what the steady state's about. We don't know everything, but we know these things, and we're willing to make those available to our fellow citizens.
Yeah, and I think, and I want to get to, obviously, the president's foreign policy. I think the one thing that resonates with me that you were talking about is, I mean, unfortunately, we almost have an attack on knowledge in our country these days. Yeah. And that, that is perceived as elitist and something that should be discarded. And now I feel like we're in a world, for example, for all those really savvy, educated folks in Nebraska or anywhere around the country, they're basically being gaslit. in terms of, what the realities are versus, the version of the truth that, the administration is trying to push out. And I think, as it relates to the farmers, I think that, there was, at least at one point, sort of an initial struggle of, what do you do? Do you, advance the immigration agenda, or do you let farmers, run their companies and do their jobs? But now it just seems like that has been wholly taken over essentially by the Stephen Miller agenda. But that is probably another podcast for another day.
I think that's another one. Yeah.
So let's move on and talk a little bit about the president's foreign policy. And, one of the things that, as we were preparing for this episode, that you and I had talked about, that I'd love for you to talk to our audience about, is your view that the president's foreign policy is much more financially focused, that it is sort of driven by, his relationships with, titans of industry, or, the wealthy and powerful sort of around the world, and why that, or I guess maybe how that influences the strategic decisions that are made.
Yeah, well, the first thing is, this is a very personal system. It's one guy.
Right.
And if Trump wakes up and says, today it's Greenland, tomorrow it's Ukraine, the day after it's Nepal, that's what everybody runs and chases. That's a terrible way to govern the world's greatest country at 350 million people. Now, his particular quirks are obviously this focus on carbon energy, on opposition to renewables, and a real belief that if he can only talk to a strongman leader, and it is man is what he looks for,
of course,
that then he can find some good deals. But on top of it, he wants to get a piece of every deal.
Sure.
So NVIDIA gets to sell chips to China. That's a disaster for national security.
Right.
There are only so many chips to go around. He's going to take them away from new U.S. companies and sell them to China, which will use them to build technology that will outcompete the American companies. But he wants to get a certain percentage of the sales into the U.S. government. Sometimes it's more personal. People close to him are the ones who get the sales rights. And it's the combination of having this be rooted in the prejudices of one guy and his limited knowledge of the world, and then his need to measure success by seeing that somebody is getting ready cash. This was how he ran his business. He wasn't a long-term build and allow things to flow businessman. He built things if he got paid, or he licensed his name, got consulting money, took out loans for construction, and then if he operated a club, he would get paid the membership dues. It was always ready cash. That's the only way he understands that deals are being done. So every one of his peace initiatives includes some element of an American firm, or potentially firms sometimes close to him, sometimes not, somehow involved immediately in an extractive industry or the transportation of things, say, across the South Caucasus. And this is the way in which he measures success. It's a disaster. Like when America, in a way, like we had the best resort in the world, resort and casino.
Sure.
The way that you make money if you run a great resort and casino is that people get to come there, you provide a safe environment, and you get a small piece out of all the activity that happens.
Sure.
Trump says he wants a big piece out of whatever people do. And he doesn't like it when other people do well. He wants to do better himself. No wonder he went bankrupt running a casino 3 times, actually 4 if you count that.
But who's counting?
Because he doesn't understand that the basic point of America is we do really well when our partners are doing very well. And for short bursts, some of our partners may even do better than we do, but that makes the entire system stable, and then America does well. And he can't see that because all he sees is that there have to be individual transactions, and he has to know who's making the money and approve of that person. And you cannot run a global economy that way. So it's going to be a disaster. And I think we'll find that. Essentially, he's spending down an 80-year inheritance of American power as a global hegemon, creating rules that everybody can live by. And then he's just going to spend that down so a few of his buddies or people he can identify make money. And then we'll have to recreate a system.
And so, Jim, at the time, we're recording the news of the day is obviously Venezuela, but you can look at Greenland as well. There's been discussion of, our intervention there. There's been saber rattling about Iran. Of course, there's Gaza and Ukraine. How do you see the theory that you just laid out, sort of playing out in those locations? And then for the folks that aren't, his supporters, how does that reconcile with this, proposed or purported America First mentality?
I think the reality of all this is time. Trump's an old guy.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't talk a lot about building a movement behind him or a legacy. He's not like Xi or Putin.
Right.
They talk about getting new organs and maybe living to be 150. Trump doesn't.
Right.
And so time is the problem for him. He has 3 years left. In all likelihood, this year will be taken up with the expectation that Democrats will win the House.
Sure.
So he will either need to adjust that expectation by taking some dramatic anti-democratic step, or he's going to have to just acknowledge that his last 2 years will be spent with a more difficult governing situation. Now, why do I go into this? It's because he has 3 years. Venezuela will take decades of investment.
Sure.
Before any of its oil can begin to reach global markets in appreciable amounts. Mm-hmm. At its peak, it exported 3 million barrels of oil a day. That's a pittance for what the world needs. And it's a kind of specialty oil that can only it's best used for small purposes. Greenland will take years, if not decades, before there's a return on any investments. But he only has 3 years. And it's that problem, and you repeat that in issue after issue, where he wants to make an announcement and claim that he has done something that will last 50 years, but he will not be around to do the work. And he actually is not trying to do the work.
Right.
So it's on the rest of us to decide which of these initiatives are in America's long-term interest and get behind those. But to begin saying some of these things are not. A battle with all of Europe about rights to Greenland that the United States already has, because we already have the ability to invest as much as we want and provide security there. Denmark and Greenland have agreed to that. So we could just go and begin doing the real work to make Americans more prosperous, or we can have this battle about a Sharpie on a map that Trump wants to have. That will not, in the time he has left, that will not produce a single job or manufacturing opportunity for Americans. And that I think has to become the focus of conversation as we work through the next year or two. Which of the many things he talks about can make life better soon? And which one is he just a salesman offering a bright and beautiful future that's on a shining hill far away from here? And that's the place where I think even people who support him ought to start getting impatient to see the receipts now, not just hear about them from him.
So I think with that, I have, a couple of things to think about. And then I want to talk about, sort of what people should do now in this moment. And so I guess my thoughts are, how do you see, or, maybe given the realities of the impact of America's current instability as well as its foreign policy, so both at home and abroad, what does that mean for our place in the world, as well as for a potential slide, or maybe even a current slide, into authoritarianism? And so, sort of with that as sort of the backdrop, or maybe a little bit of the question to be answered, how do we meet the moment? What do we do?
I mean, everyone should just do the bit they can, right? Everything is is helpful. So I think standing up for independent journalists, because they're the ones who tell us what's going on. I think helping each other out. People just ought to help each other, because we've got a government that is intent on punishing people it sees as its enemies. And some of them are migrants, and some of them are Americans who don't like what they do. That's an environment of cruelty. And you add to it the kind of rhetorical cruelty that we hear from this administration. They're constantly abusing people, demeaning people, posting memes that are polarizing and divisive. And I think having people see one another as people and people who need help every so often is one of the most political acts we can all take right now. Just to say we're decent folks who look out for each other in whatever way you do that at home. And then the final bit is just back to this point about what is the steady state. Steady state are a bunch of ordinary Americans who went to work because we wanted to work on issues that mattered to the community as a whole. The knowledge that's built up in institutions that give people that mandate is so sacred. I was talking to a European leader about a year ago now, who looked at the firings of scientists and the plans to close down parts of the weather service. Some of that got rolled back, but the research into maritime issues and elsewhere. This is a seagoing nation. He said, most of our cooperation with you is based on the fact that you have the best scientists in the world talking to us about what's happening on the oceans. If you fire these people, we don't have a reason to give you priority over China anymore. I mean, we like you, Laura, but China's a better partner in many respects. That's the kind of slide that's going to come because we're turning our backs on knowledge, but we're also saying we don't want to have these institutions of independent expertise. And so one thing people can stand up for are the experts in their community, the local social service office, the local agricultural extension office, universities that do the research that have made America so prosperous and great with whatever problems we've got. So I think just those three things are things anyone can do as part of their life. But it all comes back to just be decent, because the polarization that has given us this government rests on all of us. And I think it weighs us all down. So the more we find ways to come together in different forms, that's the best answer to what we're being subjected to.
Amen. Couldn't agree more. And as a proud member, put me in, Coach. So thank you. Why don't we leave it right there? I think that's a perfect place to end. So thank you so much for joining us, Jim. What a great conversation. I think you really educated and illuminated our audience in so many different ways. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell our audience, if there's anything in particular you're working on as chair, or maybe outside of your role as a steady state that you might want to tell people about, and maybe where they could find you. As we've all been talking about, where are you on the socials?
Almost nowhere.
Spoken like a true member of the steady state.
There we go. So on with the steady state, I think it's important that we be available as a resource and shape the discussion, particularly about how America should approach threats to our people. Because we're seeing a government that wants to victimize the weak rather than focus on real threats. And I think within the steady state, we've got some exceptional people who provide security for leading corporations, leading resorts. And they look at this and say, we need a little more help from our government. And so the steady state should really be a voice in how the United States can do this in a way that keeps people safe and creates opportunities for our companies. Beyond that, I'm doing a bit of work with a few think tanks, a group called the European Council on Foreign Relations, and fellowship at an institute looking at the human sciences. So I get to broaden out from just policy. And I'll try to figure out how I can have my own voice in some of these discussions. But again, absolutely, I love working in institutions, and I'm happy to be part of an institution that's trying to put views out in the world rather than just my own byline.
Excellent. Well, so if you like what you heard on today's show, please subscribe to the Steady State Sentinel podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And please give us a 5-star review on Google. Those subscriptions and 5-star reviews help us get this important content out to the widest possible audience. The Steady State Sentinel is for you, our listeners, and we want to hear from you. Please join us for our next episode so that you can stay engaged and stay informed. Remember, protecting our democracy isn't a spectator sport. This is Peter Mina for the Steady State Sentinel, still standing watch.
Thank you for listening to the Steady State Sentinel podcast. Don't miss out on more insights and exposés from America's premier global security experts.
Also, subscribe to our Substack at substack.com/@steadystate1 and follow our social media. And join us right here next week for another exciting edition.
The Steady State is a nonprofit organization working to sustain our democracy and national security.
Join us and support our mission by visiting www.thesteadystate.org.